Picture this: a cold wind howls through the narrow lanes of a medieval village. As the last light of day fades behind the hills, the air is thick with whispers, not just of neighbors, but of something older, darker. In the flickering glow of hearth fires, families huddle close, not just for warmth, but for protection against the unseen. This was the world of the Dark Ages, where every shadow held a story, and every story held a warning. Across Europe, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the dense forests of Germany, villages were bound together not just by stone and straw, but by shared fears, legends passed down through generations, tales so vivid they felt as real as the ground beneath their feet. What if I told you these stories were more than just campfire tales? They were the heartbeat of entire communities, shaping how people lived, loved, and even how they died. Imagine a mother soothing her child with the story of the kindly household spirit who guarded their home, only to shudder at the mention of the spectral hound said to prowl the nearby moors, its howl a death omen. Or the blacksmith who refused to work on certain nights, fearing the wrath of the trickster spirit rumored to sabotage his tools. These weren't just superstitions, they were a way of making sense of a world where illness, famine, and sudden death could strike without warning. The line between myth and reality was razor thin, and crossing it could mean inviting chaos into your life. Today, we're peeling back the layers of time to uncover 22 of the most haunting legends that gripped Dark Age Europe. These aren't just ghost stories, they're windows into the minds of people who saw the supernatural in every storm, every unexplained illness, every stranger at the gate. We'll meet vengeful spirits who demanded justice, shape-shifting creatures that blurred the line between beast and man, and omens so chilling they could empty entire villages overnight. This is a journey into the shadows where folklore wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. So light a candle, steady your nerves, and let's step into a world where the veil between the living and the dead was never fully closed. By the end, you might just wonder how many of these tales still linger in the corners of our modern world, waiting to be remembered. The church trembled as thunder split the sky, the stained glass windows rattling like the teeth of a frightened congregation. Then came the sound, a snarl deeper than the storm, followed by the splintering of pews as something enormous, something unnatural, forced its way through the doors. Witnesses would later swear the beast stood taller than a man, its fur blacker than midnight, eyes burning like twin hellfires. It moved with impossible speed, leaving two parishioners dead where they knelt, their bodies untouched by claw or fang yet frozen in terror. By the time the creature vanished as suddenly as it appeared, only the scorch marks on the church door remained, along with deep grooves in the stone floor that locals claim still trace the path of its claws. This was no ordinary hound, this was Black Shuck, the Devil's Dog of East Anglia, and his visit to Bungay that August Sunday in 1577 became legend. But this wasn't just one village nightmare. From the misty glens of Scotland to the rolling hills of Wales, nearly every corner of Dark Age Europe had its own version of the phantom hound. The Welsh spoke of the CW circumflex en Annan, ghostly white dogs with red ears who hunted lost souls beneath the full moon. In Germany, the Bargus prowled crossroads, its chains rattling as it foretold doom. Even in France, tales spread of a black chien du diable that could vanish into thin air, only to reappear at the bedside of the dying. What bound these creatures together wasn't just their appearance, it was their purpose. They were watchers of thresholds, appearing at moments when the veil between worlds grew thin, during storms at midnight, or when death lingered near. To understand why these spectral dogs haunted the medieval imagination, look to the very fabric of village life. In a time before street lamps or locks, the howl of a real wolf could send families barricading their doors. But the black dog legends went deeper than fear of predators. They gave form to the invisible dangers lurking at the edges of survival: plague, famine, the sudden violence of nature. When a fisherman vanished in a squall, wasn't it easier to blame the glowing-eyed beast seen pacing the cliffs the night before? When a child fell ill after playing near the old burial mound, surely it was the Barghest's breath that poisoned the air. These stories weren't just warnings, they were explanations, a way to name the unnameable forces that shaped lives as capriciously as the weather. The most chilling detail in the Bungay account isn't the deaths or the claw marks, it's where the creature chose to strike. A church wasn't just a building, it was the heart of a village spiritual armor, a place meant to be safe from darkness. For something to violate that sanctuary meant no corner of the world was truly protected. Perhaps that's why even today, travelers in East Anglia speak of feeling watched on lonely roads, or why some still refuse to say the name Shuck aloud after sunset. The black dog never really left, it just learned new places to hide. The night air itself seemed to hold its breath when the sound came first as distant thunder, then as the pounding of hooves where no horse should tread. Across thatched roofs and frozen fields, villagers barred their doors against the sky, for they knew the riders of the wild hunt never traveled alone. To see them was to witness the fabric of the world tearing open, a spectral cavalcade trailing storms and wildfire as they galloped between realms. In England they called it Herla's host, led by a lost king cursed to ride until the end of time. In Scandinavia, the god Odin himself led the charge, his cloak billowing like storm clouds as his eight-legged horse Sleipnir tore through the stars. But whether the stories named Arthur, Hall, or the devil as their leader, one truth connected every version: to lock eyes with the hunt was to stare into the abyss. What made this legend so universal? Look to the darkest chapters of medieval life: the endless wars, the plagues that left fields untended, the famines that turned brother against brother. The Wild Hunt wasn't just a story, it was the embodiment of that helpless terror, the sense that catastrophe could descend without warning. When villagers whispered of hearing phantom horns in the wind after a bad harvest, they weren't just spinning tales. They were giving form to the invisible forces that could wipe out entire communities overnight. Even the timing held meaning. Most sightings occurred during the dead months of winter, when hunger gnawed hardest and the line between life and death felt thinnest. Consider the French version, the Mesnée de Heliquin, where the damned rode with faces blackened by hellfire. Some scholars trace its roots to memories of the Viking raids, real-life horsemen who appeared without warning, leaving devastation in their wake. Others see echoes of ancient pagan rites, where processions of masked spirits were said to escort souls to the afterlife, but perhaps the most haunting detail lies in the hunt's aftermath. Survivors told of finding strange footprints in the snow, of dead leaves swirling in unnatural patterns, and worst of all, of recognizing faces among the riders. To vanish without a trace wasn't just tragedy in the Dark Ages, it was suspicion. Those taken by the hunt might be mourned, but they might also be whispered about, their disappearance proof of some hidden sin. This duality between awe and accusation reveals the legend's true power. The Wild Hunt wasn't merely a harbinger of doom, it was a mirror held up to medieval society. When famine struck, someone must have offended the spirits. When a child went missing near the woods, perhaps they'd been chosen, or perhaps they'd strayed too close to forbidden knowledge. The stories gave people a language for their fears, yes, but also a way to assign blame in a world where suffering often had no clear cause. And then there were those who claimed to join the hunt willingly. Old German tales speak of witches and cunning folk who'd leave their bodies behind to ride with Hall, returning at dawn with secrets whispered by the dead. These outliers hint at something rarely discussed, that for some the hunt wasn't just a threat, but a twisted kind of salvation. In an era where poverty and oppression were inescapable for most, the idea of trading your soul for freedom, even a monstrous one, held a dark allure. So the next time you hear geese flying overhead on a winter's night, listen closely. That faint echo beneath their cries might just be the baying of otherworldly hounds, or the laughter of riders who haven't stopped hunting in 1,000 years. Their legend endures because it asks a question we still can't answer. When disaster comes, do we face it as victims, as witnesses, or as willing participants in our own unraveling? The howl didn't sound like any wolf the villagers had ever heard. It came not from the forest, but from inside Jacques' cottage, moments before the screams began. When neighbors burst through the door at dawn, they found the farmer's hands still caked with dirt from clawing at his own skin, his teeth broken from gnawing at the iron shackles he'd begged them to forge. This was no ordinary madness, the priest declared. This was la loup Garou, the French nightmare made flesh. Unlike the howling beasts of modern tales, the werewolves of Dark Age Europe weren't just monsters, they were cautionary figures, victims of curses as often as they were perpetrators. Take the chilling case of Gilles Garnier, a hermit tried in 1573 for slaughtering children near Dole. His confession spoke of a wolf pelt that fused to his body during the full moon, forcing him to hunt, but court records reveal something darker, a starving man who may have believed his own hunger was supernatural. What set European werewolf legends apart was their heartbreaking humanity. In Germany, the Wolfsegner were said to be men cursed by their own sins, their transformations triggered by acts of violence or desperation. Slavic tales describe the Vielkalek as souls trapped between death and damnation, their bodies twisting into beasts when they tried to speak prayers at their own funerals. These weren't creatures who reveled in their power, they were prisoners of it, their stories reflecting very real fears of famine, disease, and the fragility of morality in hard times. When an entire family vanished from a Norwegian village in the winter of 1588, locals didn't blame wolves, they whispered of a neighbor who'd been seen chewing bark like an animal the week before. The church fed these fears, linking lycanthropy to witchcraft and devilry. Medieval trial records are filled with accounts of accused werewolves claiming witches rubbed them with enchanted salves, or that Satan himself slipped wolf pelts over their sleeping forms. But beneath the hysteria lay a deeper dread, the terror of losing control. In an era where a bad harvest could reduce a pious farmer to theft or an outbreak of plague might make a mother abandon her sick child, the line between man and beast felt terrifyingly thin. Werewolf stories became a way to confront the unthinkable, that hunger could make monsters of us all. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from French folklore, where some loup Garou were said to regain human form only to wake with no memory of their crimes, their clothes shredded, their mouths full of fur. It's this detail that lingers, not the claws or the fangs, but the dawning horror of realizing what you've become. In a world without psychology or medicine, the idea that the mind could fracture so completely was more frightening than any fairy tale. That's why these legends endured long after the witch trials faded. They weren't just about wolves, they were about the wildness waiting inside every person, the howl that rises in the throat when the world pushes you past the edge of reason. So the next time you hear a rustle in the woods at twilight, ask yourself, is it truly an animal out there, or something far closer to home? After all, the darkest legends never die, they simply learn new shapes. The road went silent first, not even the wind dared stir when the Dullahan's skeletal horse pawed the earth. Then came the sound no villager ever wished to hear, the creak of his black carriage, its wheels wrapped in funeral shrouds, the lantern swinging from a pole made of bone casting more shadow than light. And worst of all, the voice. No mouth should have been able to speak, yet the severed head he carried under his arm would grin wide as it called names into the dark, each one a death sentence for whoever answered. Ireland's headless harbinger didn't just predict doom, he delivered it, his very presence bending the rules of the natural world. Doors might keep out thieves or wolves, but the Dullahan needed no handle, he'd dissolve through solid oak like smoke, his whip of vertebrae cracking the air as he claimed what was owed. This wasn't just another ghost story. The Dullahan, along with his Breton counterpart the Ankou and the Welsh Angau, represented something far older than medieval Christianity, the Celtic understanding of fate as an unbreakable thread. Unlike later Grim Reaper tales, these figures weren't servants of death, they were its embodiment, as inevitable as sunset. Folklorists trace their origins to pre-Christian psychopomps, beings tasked with guiding souls to the afterlife. But where modern depictions soften death with hooded anonymity, the Dullahan forced witnesses to confront mortality head-on literally. His grotesque laughter and penchant for hurling buckets of blood at those who dared spy on him served as reminders. Death wasn't just coming, it was watching, waiting, and utterly indifferent to locks or prayers. What made the legend particularly chilling was its specificity. While the Anku carried a scythe and the Angau a spear, the Dullahan's tools were intimately personal. His spine whip didn't just inflict pain, it symbolically connected each vertebra, mirroring the unbroken chain of lives death would eventually harvest. And that lantern, some versions claim it was fashioned from a stolen saint's skull, its glow strong enough to blind mortals who glimpsed it. These weren't arbitrary horrors, they were reflections of deep cultural anxieties. In a society where genealogies were memorized for generations and ancestors were honored daily, the idea of death-severing heads, the seed of identity and memory, struck at the heart of what made life meaningful. Yet for all his terror, the Dullahan wasn't without rules. He couldn't cross running water, a holdover from ancient beliefs about its purifying power. Gold left at crossroads might delay his visit, though never cancel it, and like many Celtic fairies, he harbored a peculiar hatred of being observed, hence the blood-throwing. This complex morality hints at something beyond mindless horror. The Dullahan wasn't cruel, he was inevitable, a force as natural as winter. His appearances often coincided with times of social upheaval, plagues, invasions, when communities needed to rationalize sudden loss. By giving death a face or lack thereof, people could rail against it, bargain with it, even mock it in folktales where drunkards outwitted him with clever wordplay. Modern sightings still trickle in from rural Ireland, always following the same pattern. A witness walking home at twilight hears carriage wheels where no road exists, catches a whiff of rotting roses, and freezes as a voice whispers something just beyond comprehension. Whether hallucination or lingering superstition, these accounts prove the Dullahan's power endures, because in the end, his true horror wasn't the severed head or the spine whip, it was the reminder that some doors, no matter how sturdy, can never truly be locked. Now let's leave the roads of Ireland behind and plunge into deeper waters where Scandinavia's deadliest spirit didn't just drown sailors, but stole their very voices. If you thought mermaids were dangerous, wait until you meet the Draugr. The water looked calm that evening, too calm. The fishermen muttered, laying extra bread by the oars as their fathers had taught them. They knew better than to trust mirrors without ripples or songs that carried across still lakes with no singer in sight. That was the Nixie's favorite trick, stillness before the storm. In the folklore of Germany and Scandinavia, few spirits were as cunning or cruel as these shape-shifting water demons. Unlike the seductive mermaids of southern tales, Nixies didn't bother with false romance. They played with their food. One moment a drowned man might glimpse a golden-haired boy beckoning from the reeds. The next, a coal-black horse would appear on the shore, its mane dripping with algae, inviting riders to their doom. And always there was the singing, a melody so sweet it could make a mother forget her child's name, luring them deeper until the water closed over their heads without a splash. What made the Nix so terrifying wasn't just its violence, but its unpredictability. In some villages, legends spoke of Nixies teaching humans secret cures, or playing fiddles at weddings so long as they were given the first dance. A farmer might leave a pat of butter by the riverbank one night and find his nets bursting with fish at dawn, but woe to anyone who forgot the offering. The same spirit that granted blessings could twist into a nightmare, dragging entire boats under for sport. This duality mirrored the very waters they ruled, lakes that nourished crops one season and swallowed homes the next. Folklorists see in these tales a desperate attempt to rationalize the indiscriminate cruelty of nature. Why did one child drown while another was spared? Perhaps the Nix favored them, or perhaps someone forgot the bread. The most chilling versions of the legend come from medieval Germany, where the Nix wasn't just a killer but a thief of souls. Victims weren't merely drowned, they were trapped underwater, forced to serve the creature for eternity. Some accounts describe ghostly markets beneath the waves, where undead merchants traded drowned pearls for scraps of sunlight. Others tell of Nixies mimicking the voices of the dead to lure grieving families into the depths. But here's the twist: the Nix wasn't invincible. Iron could wound it, church bells drove it away, and some stories claim knowing its true name gave you power over it. This wasn't just superstition, it was survival strategy. By giving the chaos of floods and accidents rules, even bizarre ones, people regained a sliver of control. You can still trace the Nix's influence in modern folklore. Scotland's Kelpie and England's Neck share its love of equestrian disguises, while Scandinavian parents warn children away from lily pads that shift position when blinked at. Even the brothers Grimm recorded a Nix variant in their tale of the Water Nixie, where the creature demands a human life as payment for building a mill. But perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in music. Composers from Wagner to folk bands still evoke the Nix's song, those minor key melodies that sound both sorrowful and seductive, reminding us that beauty and danger often share the same voice. Now imagine a demon that didn't just ride the storm, but devoured it. Where the Nix ruled water, the Nexterra commanded the sky itself, and its hunger could reduce villages to splinters. The song began where the forest met the river, notes so clear they made the water itself seem to pause mid-current. Those foolish enough to follow the sound would find her perched on a silver birch branch, wings shimmering like dawn-lit clouds, her face at once human and impossibly alien. This was the Alcanost, Russia's celestial songstress, and her voice carried neither warning nor threat, only a beauty so overwhelming it could unravel memory itself. Fishermen spoke of waking knee-deep in the shallows with no recollection of dropping their nets, their pockets filled with pearlescent feathers. Shepherds would return home at dusk, their flocks scattered, murmuring about hymns that left their ears ringing for days. Unlike the dark-winged siren, whose melodies foretold doom, the Alcanos sang of paradise, yet both shared a terrible truth: some wonders aren't meant for mortal ears. What made this creature so haunting was her duality. Byzantine icons depicted her with saintly halos, blending Christian angelology with pagan storm myths. Villagers left offerings of honey and grain, believing her songs could ease childbirth or bless crops, but only if she chose to sing toward the village. Turn her back and those same notes might bring fever or drought. The most chilling legends warned of her eggs, said to be laid on midsummer nights when the sea turned as calm as glass. These weren't ordinary shells, they were storms in waiting. The moment they hatched far from shore, waves would rise like walls, swallowing ships whole. Here the Alcanost mirrored nature's own contradictions: life-giver and destroyer, comforter and thief of breath. Scholars trace her origins to Syrian bird goddesses carried north by traders, but the medieval Slavs wove her into their own tapestry of fears. In a land where winters could starve entire regions and spring floods erased villages without trace, the Alcanos became a metaphor for nature's sublime indifference. Her songs weren't just beautiful, they were a test. Could you listen and still remember to hunt, to sow, to breathe? The answer lay in the birch groves, where more than one wanderer was found frozen in mid-step, eyes wide as if still watching her flight, their lips blue but curved in smiles. Yet there's a twist that separates her from siren tales. The Alcanost wasn't malicious, she didn't lure, she simply existed, her voice a force as beyond morality as sunlight or snowfall. This nuance reveals a worldview far more complex than mere superstition. For medieval Russians, ecstasy and danger weren't opposites, they were two notes in the same song, each necessary, each capable of tipping the other into catastrophe. The Alkanos legend endures not because it frightens, but because it asks a question we still grapple with: can something be sacred and deadly in the same breath? Now shift your gaze from the skies to the soil beneath your feet, where an army not of feathers but of bones awaits its hour. When the earth itself decides to spit back the dead, no song can soothe what comes next. The wind carried more than just salt from the sea that night. It brought whispers in a language no villager could place, a cacophony of overlapping voices neither quite human nor fully animal. Then came the shadows against the moon, not the orderly V of migrating geese, but a swirling, chaotic mass that blotted out stars as it descended. Those who dared peek through their shutters swore the figures had arms, not wings, their tattered outlines flapping like cursed sails. This was the Sluagh, the unforgiven dead of Celtic lore, and they didn't just haunt the skies they hunted. What set these spirits apart from other ghostly legends was their utter lack of mercy. Unlike the Banshee's warning wail or the Dullahan's single-target vengeance, the Sluagh operated as a collective nightmare. Scottish hearth tales describe them snatching souls straight from sick rooms, their icy fingers leaving behind nothing but a cold spot on the pillow. Irish mothers would hang iron scissors over cradles, believing the metal's memory of being forged could repel them, but the most unsettling detail. Communities often left their windows unlatched by a finger's width, not out of carelessness but as a grim negotiation: take the offering of passage, but leave the living be. It was a daily reminder that survival sometimes meant compromising with the darkness. Historians trace these legends to layered traumas. The timing of Sluagh sightings often coincided with the autumn months, when Viking longships once appeared on horizons like storm clouds. Their screaming flocks may have been folk memory of raiders' battle cries echoing down valleys. Later, the devastation of the Black Death added fresh horrors. Imagine watching your neighbor's corpse carried out at dawn, only to hear what sounded like their voice among the shrieking horde that night. The Sluagh became a way to explain the unexplainable. Why did some plague victims linger while others vanished overnight? Why did healthy adults collapse mid-breath? The answer hovered just beyond the rooftop, waiting, yet there's a darker psychology at work here. Unlike most malevolent spirits, the Sluagh were once human souls so twisted by sin they couldn't enter the afterlife. This wasn't just fear of death, it was terror of what might come after death. Medieval church records from the Hebrides mention confessed criminals begging priests to weigh their bodies down with stones, hoping to anchor themselves against the Sluagh's pull. The legend served as both warning and social control. Transgress too far, and you might not just die, you could become part of the very force that preys on the vulnerable. Modern paranormal accounts still surface in coastal villages, particularly during autumn equinoxes. Fishermen speak of radios crackling with garbled voices when no stations broadcast, or GPS systems failing over certain patches of water. Skeptics blame magnetic anomalies or bird migrations, but old families keep their scissors sharp and their windows slightly ajar, because some fears can't be reasoned away, they can only be negotiated with, generation after generation. Now let's trade the howling gales of Scotland for the sun-baked hills of Spain, where chaos wears a grin and mischief has claws. If you think goblins are just petty thieves, you've never met the Trascu. The first sign was always the same: a single clay cup tipped over on the hearth, its contents pooling into a shape almost like a grinning mouth. Then the real games would begin: fresh milk curdling before dawn, shoes tied together in impossible knots, the last ember of the fire mysteriously drowning in its own ashes. But woe to anyone who cursed the culprit too loudly. El Trascu listened, and the red-capped trickster preferred his revenge served cold. Northern Spanish households knew this pint-sized menace all too well. a creature small enough to hide in a bread oven yet cunning enough to outwit entire families. Unlike the shadowy poltergeists of other legends, El Trascu flaunted his presence. Villagers described him as a dwarfish man in a crimson hat, his left hand perpetually pierced by a hole no needle could mend. That detail wasn't just for frights, it explained why he dropped things so often, why salt scattered inexplicably across floors. Here was a spirit who turned his flaws into weapons, a reminder that not all supernatural forces were grand or terrifying. Some simply made daily life inconvenient, yet for all his mischief, families rarely wanted him gone completely. A well-treated Trascu might mend broken tools overnight or whisper the location of lost livestock. His duality reflected a hard truth of medieval life. Chaos and luck were two sides of the same coin. The most ingenious part of the legend, the banishment ritual. Give El Trascu an impossible chore weaving sand, filling a cracked jug, and he'd vanish in a huff, unable to resist proving his cleverness even in defeat. This wasn't just folklore, it was domestic strategy. By framing exasperations as a game, villagers reclaimed agency over the unpredictable. When butter refused to churn or a loom's thread snapped for the 10th time, they could shrug and say, "The Trascu's bored today," rather than succumbing to despair. The tales also served as covert parenting tools. Children how to tidy their toys lest the Trascu hide them learned responsibility through story rather than scolding. Modern psychologists might recognize something familiar in these legends. The Trascu personified the subconscious frustrations of pre-industrial life, the endless, invisible labor of maintaining a household where every task required manual effort. Anthropomorphizing spoiled food or misplaced tools made those setbacks feel intentional, and therefore avoidable. Leave out a bowl of cream, and maybe the butter would churn smoothly tomorrow. It was a worldview where even bad luck had rules. Now, imagine a being who turned mischief into genuine malice, whose smile promised not pranks but paralysis. Across the Alps in Italy, another creature waited, one who didn't bother hiding shoes when she could stop hearts mid-beat. La Strega Bella's laughter wasn't just chilling, it was lethal. The first chill of autumn wasn't just a change of season in rural Italy, it was the hour when old women whispered that La Strega sharpened her bone needles. Mothers would count their sleeping children twice before midnight, for these weren't mere bedtime story villains. Medieval court records from Tuscany describe trials where peasants swore under oath that witches drained cows dry without a mark, or that their neighbor's grandmother could make a man's beard fall out with a single glance. But the most chilling testimonies involved the Sabbath's midnight gatherings where the Strega were said to feast on stolen communion wafers and commune with goat-headed demons. What makes these legends so fascinating is how they reflected Italy's tangled religious history. Beneath the surface of Catholicism, older beliefs pulse like a second heartbeat. Take the cult of Eradia, a messianic figure who supposedly taught witchcraft as a weapon for the oppressed. Folklorists trace her origins to the 14th century, Gospel of the Witches, where she appears as a moon-born daughter of Diana, sent to teach peasants magic against their feudal lords. This wasn't just superstition, it was covert resistance. When a barren woman left offerings to Eradia at a crossroads or a farmer whispered spells to protect his harvest, they weren't just warding off evil. They were preserving a shadow religion that predated Rome itself. The tools used against La Strega reveal just how deeply these fears ran. Garlic wasn't just for vampires, it was hung over cradles to confuse a witch's senses. The sign of the horns gesture we now associate with rock music, originally a ward against the evil eye, formed by extending the pinky and index finger while gripping the others with the thumb. Even church bells played a role. Some villages rang them during thunderstorms not just to pray, but because the clangor was said to tangle a witch's flying hair. These weren't random rituals, they formed a survival manual for a world where misfortune wasn't accidental, it was personal. but the darkest shift in the legend came when the Strega transformed from village wise woman into something monstrous. Medieval church paintings depicted them breastfeeding demons, their bodies twisted perversions of motherhood. Inquisition manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum claimed they could steal a man's virility or make crops wither with a curse. Historians now recognize this as textbook scapegoating. When droughts or plagues struck, someone had to bear the blame. Often it was the elderly, the unmarried, or those who knew too much about herbal medicine. The Strega became a canvas for every medieval anxiety, disease, starvation, even the terrifying independence of women who lived outside male control. Now let's journey north where an even more intimate horror awaited. Imagine a demon that didn't just haunt homes, it crept into children's beds and made them instruments of its will. The Germanic Alp wasn't content with nightmares, it demanded participation. The straw rustled when there should have been no breeze, that was the first warning. Then came the smell, like damp grain left too long in the barn, and the slow creak of something stiff-limbed moving through the orchard after dark. German children knew better than to test their parents' patience when that scent lingered by the window. Be good or der Butzemann will carry you off in his sack. Unlike festive Krampus with his chains and bells, this terror wore no costume. He was the costume, an empty thing of bound stalks and tattered cloth that somehow walked, its hollow eyes seeing every misdeed. But the Butzemann wasn't just a phantom. His roots coiled deep into pre-Christian Europe, where straw effigies were buried in fields to ensure a good harvest. Folklorists recognize him as a corrupted memory of those rituals, the spirit of the last sheaf, once revered, now twisted into a punisher. The timing mattered. While Krampus came but once a year, the Butzemann watched endlessly, his presence peaking at the autumn equinox when villagers burned his likeness to protect their homes. This wasn't just discipline, it was cyclical justice, a reminder that nature's generosity demanded respect in return. The legend's brilliance lay in its adaptability. Along the Rhine, he was a crooked farmer who offered naughty children as tribute to the soil. Bavarian tales described him stitching stolen boys into scarecrows, their muffled cries mistaken for crows in the corn. And in the Black Forest, where timber was life, parents warned that the Butzemann's sack was woven from the bark of hanged men's trees. Each variation served the same purpose, to bind behavior to survival. A child who wandered too far might fall down a mine shaft, one who stole bread could doom a family's winter stores. The Butzemann made those stakes visceral, transforming abstract dangers into something that rustled under the bed. Yet the most fascinating detail isn't his cruelty, but his persistence. When Germanic immigrants carried the legend to America, it merged with indigenous bogeymen and African folklore, evolving into the boogeyman we know today. That journey reveals an uncomfortable truth: every culture trains its young through fear. Whether straw effigy or shadow under the stairs, these stories endure because they work. Long after children stopped believing, the lessons stuck: don't stray, don't steal, don't test the darkness. Now follow the mist west to Wales, where another mimic walks, but this one doesn't just punish disobedience. It becomes you. The Gwilgi doesn't snatch children, it replaces them, wagging its phantom tail as it leads you toward a fate worse than any sack. The barking seemed to come from inside the walls at first, a sound too deep for any farm dog, though the family's hounds cowered by the hearth. Then the footprints appeared, pressed into dew-heavy grass but leading nowhere, each pad the size of a man's fist. By the time the father glimpsed the creature crouched beside his daughter's bed, its breath reeking of wet charcoal, he already knew. This was no stray. The Gwilgi always chose its victims carefully, its mangy black fur bristling with uncanny intelligence. Welsh lore described it as a spectral hound, yes, but also as something far worse, a perfect copyist. It didn't just haunt, it studied, learning its prey's habits until even a mother might not notice the switch. What set this legend apart was its psychological horror. Unlike the Butsamans' blunt kidnappings, the Gwilgi worked through erosion. A child returned from the woods too quiet might really be the thing, their laughter just slightly out of sync with the family's. Shepherds told of finding entire flocks herded into standing stones by a dog that left no tracks in snow. The worst accounts came from mining villages, where men swore they'd seen doubles of themselves underground, their faces blank except for those glowing, hungry eyes. The Gwilga's genius was its ambiguity. Was it a demon, the ghost of an abused animal, or in the way rural Welsh communities whispered when crops failed, a punishment for hidden sins? Unlike straightforward bogeymen, it forced adults to question their own senses, turning suspicion inward. Every odd behavior in a loved one became suspect. In an era without psychology, the legend gave form to very real fears: dementia, possession, the terror of watching someone you love become unrecognizable. You can still trace its influence today. Modern Welsh horror films feature doppelgangers with animalistic traits, and psychologists note how local folktales about changed children mirror symptoms of autism or trauma. The Gwilgi never really vanished, it just learned new disguises. After all, the scariest monsters aren't the ones that leap from shadows, they're the ones that convince you the shadows were home all along. Now let's leave the hounds behind and sail north, where an entire island was said to vanish beneath the waves, along with anyone foolish enough to answer its call. The fishermen shouldn't have been able to see High Brassel that morning, not through the fog, not when old maps placed the Phantom Isle leagues west of Ireland. Yet there it shimmered, its cliffs too steep, its trees too green, a mirage that made their compass spin like a child's top. The wise crossed themselves and turned their boats. The desperate rowed closer, lured by tales of towers built of gold or fountains that cured any sickness. Neither group ever told the truth, because High Brassel wasn't an island at all. It was a test. Celtic folklore brims with vanishing lands, but this one held a special cruelty. Unlike Atlantis-style drownings, High Brassel reappeared cyclically, once every 7 years, wrapped in sea mist so thick it seemed solid. Some legends claimed it housed an advanced race who'd mastered immortality. Others swore it was the afterlife's waiting room, where souls lingered before judgment. But the most chilling versions described something far simpler: a void. Sailors who stepped ashore found no people, no treasure, just an endless loop of empty streets and cold hearths. By the time they realized the island was peeling away their memories, their very identities, the waves had already reclaimed the shore. Historians trace these tales to real maritime disasters. The Porcupine Bank, a sunken landmass off Ireland's coast, may have inspired the myth, its shoals wrecking ships that strayed too close, but the psychological underpinnings run deeper. For coastal communities where every breadwinner risked the sea's whims, High Brassel became a metaphor for false hope. Its cyclical appearances mirrored the cruel optimism of fishing seasons. One good haul could erase years of hunger, if only the weather held. The legend warned against gambling with forces beyond human control, yet there's a twist in modern sightings. Radar glitches and magnetic anomalies still plague vessels near the Porcupine Bank, with captains reporting ghost land on their screens. Oceanographers blame methane vents disrupting sonar, but on stormy nights when the radio crackles with static, even scientists pause, because some stories don't need to be true to hold power. They just need to remind us that the world's edges are never quite where we left them. Next, we venture east, where a creature didn't just hide in the woods, but wore the woods as camouflage. When the trees themselves start hunting, where do you run? The meadow looked empty at first glance, just another sunlit stretch of Welsh grassland, dotted with wildflowers. But if you lingered too long near those deceptively perfect rings of mushrooms, you might catch the scent of honeyed wine on the breeze, or hear laughter pitched just beyond human range. These were the borders of Annan, the other world, and the Tylwyth Teg didn't appreciate uninvited guests. Forget the dainty fairies of Victorian storybooks. These beings stood nearly as tall as mortals, their beauty so unnerving it made the eyes ache. Some wore gowns woven from spider silk, others cloaks of living ivy, but all moved with a grace that betrayed their inhuman nature, and they were always watching. What set the Tylwyth Teg apart from other European fairies was their eerie moral flexibility. Steal milk from their sacred cows, and they might blight your crops for generations. Yet leave an offering of fresh-baked bread at a crossroads, and the next morning you might find your sick child's fever broken, or your barren field suddenly lush with wheat. Medieval Welsh law codes even reference them, warning farmers to leave portions of their harvest unplowed, lest the fair folk take offense. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a survival strategy. In a world where drought or disease could erase entire bloodlines, the Tylwyth Teg became a way to explain both disaster and unexpected fortune. Their underground kingdom, Annwn, blurred the lines between pagan afterlife and Christian cosmology. Some tales described it as a paradise where feasts never ended and youth never faded. Others spoke of a labyrinth of caverns where lost souls wandered until they forgot their own names. This duality mirrored the Welsh people's own spiritual transition, old gods slowly recast as saints, sacred springs rebranded as holy wells. The Tylwyth Teg became cultural middle ground, neither damned like demons nor sanctified like angels. Even their name reflected this ambiguity. Tylwyth Teg translates to fair family, but locals often whispered it as Y Dynon Bach Teg, the little pretty people, a deliberate understatement to avoid attracting their attention. The most chilling accounts involve changelings, not the sickly infants of other folklore, but perfect duplicates that could fool even a mother. One 13th century chronicle tells of a miner who returned home after a year underground to find another version of himself already living his life. The real horror wasn't the imposter's presence, but the way his wife and children preferred it. Here, the legend exposed medieval anxieties about identity and belonging. What if your loved ones didn't notice you'd been replaced? What if you weren't the person you remembered being? Modern Wales still bears their fingerprints. Farmers avoid building on ferry paths, and construction crews report unnerving equipment failures when ancient oak groves are disturbed. But the Tylwyth Teg's true legacy lies deeper. They represent a world where morality wasn't black and white, where the supernatural wasn't just monstrous or divine, but as complex as the people who imagined it. Which makes you wonder, if these beings were born from human hopes and fears, what does that say about us? Now, shift your gaze to the Baltic coast, where another entity thrived on human emotion, not through bargains or tricks, but by feasting on sorrow itself. The veil didn't just haunt the grieving, it grew stronger with every tear. The weeping started at dusk, a sound so raw it made the pines shudder, a woman's voice choked with centuries of sorrow. Travelers who followed it never returned, their bodies found weeks later half submerged in bogs, faces frozen in expressions of eerie calm. This was Lama's calling card. Across Latvia and Lithuania, her legend slithered through villages like cold mist, a cautionary tale woven into the very fabric of grief. Some said she was the ghost of a bride drowned by her betrothed, her wedding gown now a shroud of rotting lace. Others whispered she was older than Christianity, a fertility spirit twisted by time into something hungry and vengeful, her tears acidic enough to scar birch bark. What made Lama uniquely terrifying was her prey. Unlike banshees who warned of death or rusalkas who lured with desire, she sought those already broken by loss. A widower staring too long into the river might hear his wife's voice in her sobs. A cheating husband would swear the cries belonged to the lover he'd abandoned. Her power wasn't in deception, but reflection. She mirrored back the pain her victims carried, amplifying it until they walked willingly into the mire. Folklorists note this wasn't random cruelty. Medieval Baltic societies viewed excessive mourning as dangerous, a conduit for malevolent spirits. Llama personified that fear, her legend enforcing cultural taboos, weep too loudly at funerals, and you might summon more than sympathy. The most chilling versions of the tale come from coastal fishing villages. There, Llama didn't just weep, she sang lullabies in the voices of drowned sailors, her melodies pulling entire families into the waves. This variation reveals a brutal truth: in communities where men vanished at sea daily, unchecked grief threatened survival. The living had to keep mending nets, salting fish, bearing children. Llama's stories became a grim coping mechanism, transforming survivors' guilt into something external, a monster you could blame instead of the uncaring ocean. Yet traces of her origins linger. In spring rituals, Latvian women still leave offerings of honey and amber at forest springs, a faint echo of the goddess Llama might once have been. Modern psychologists might recognize her as the embodiment of depressive spirals, the way sorrow, left untended, can become self-consuming. That's why her legend endures, not in fear but in understanding. Some wounds don't heal if you let them fester in silence. Now shift your gaze from the misty Baltic bogs to the jagged peaks of the Swiss Alps, where another creature weaponized human vulnerability not with tears, but with ice. The Firstel's breath didn't just chill the air, it froze souls mid-prayer, leaving behind statues with eyes still screaming. The first warning was never the growl, but the silence, birds falling mute in the pines, streams running suddenly clear of fish, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Then came the scent, like wet fur left too long in the sun, and the unmistakable drag of something heavy through the alpine grass. Swiss shepherds knew better than to search for the source. This was the tatzelworm's domain, a creature neither snake nor cat but some nightmarish fusion of both, its stubby clawed legs propelling it faster than any man could run. Witnesses described eyes that gleamed like polished coins in the dark, a mouth too wide for its wedge-shaped head, and breath so foul it could kill a goat at 10 paces. What made this legend stick wasn't just the horror, it was the specificity. Unlike dragons that haunted generic caves, the tatzelworm favored limestone crevices near grazing lands, striking when storms rolled in. Farmers swore it melted into the fog like living mist, but here's where the tale twists. While most medieval monsters were pure fabrication, the tatzelworm might have roots in real encounters. 18th century naturalists catalogued bizarre reports from the Alps: serpentine beasts with whiskered snouts, seen slithering into meltwater tunnels, or the occasional discovery of skeletons with elongated rib cages resembling fused limbs. Modern zoologists suspect misidentified otters, or even surviving relics of prehistoric amphibians, their bones warped by mountain folk unfamiliar with paleontology. Yet the creature's most chilling feature, its alleged ability to spit venom, hints at deeper fears. Alpine villages lived and died by their water sources. A single contaminated well could doom an entire valley. The tatzelworm's toxic breath may have personified very real tragedies, poisoned springs from mineral runoff, or carcasses rotting upstream. The legend's endurance reveals how folklore evolves to explain the unexplainable. When 19th century miners blasted new tunnels through the Dolomites, fresh sightings erupted near construction sites. Some descriptions now included metallic scales, as if the creature had absorbed the industrialization threatening its habitat. Even the name shifted from the Germanic tatzelworm, clawed worm, to the Italian stolen worm, tunnel worm, reflecting changing landscapes and languages. This adaptability made it a blueprint for later cryptids, proving that the best monsters aren't static, but mirrors of whatever frightens a culture most. Now journey east to Hungary, where a blood-drinking terror stalked long before Bram Stoker put pen to paper. Forget Dracula's castle, this predator hid in plain sight, its victims rotting from the inside out while their families slept unaware. The candlelight always burned a little too blue in the corners of the barn when the L'Arc came calling. Some knew it by the scent cloying and sweet like rotting fruit, or the way their shadows would stretch unnaturally long against the walls, as if something were standing just behind them, breathing in time. This was no ordinary specter. Hungary's most insidious shapeshifter didn't just haunt, it seduced, slipping into the beds of the lonely and the lovelorn in forms tailored to their deepest yearnings. A widow might wake to find her late husband's fingers combing through her hair, only to realize by dawn that his touch left her weaker, her reflection in the washbasin gaunt and hollow-eyed. A shepherd could swear he'd penned his flock safely at dusk, yet discover every lamb listless at sunrise, their fleeces matted with a sticky, tar-like residue. What made the L'Arc so terrifying wasn't its cruelty, but its patience. Unlike vampires that drained blood in a single night, this spirit fed in increments, a sip of vitality here, a nibble of sanity there, leaving its victims just enough strength to crave its return. Folklorists trace its roots to pagan fertility spirits corrupted by Christian dread of the flesh. The very methods used to repel it reveal medieval anxieties. Poppy seeds scattered at thresholds played on the creature's obsessive need to count, a metaphor for the way forbidden desires could consume a person's thoughts. Mirrors, too, were weapons, hung facing doorways. They forced the L'Arc to confront its true form, breaking its illusion. These weren't just superstitions, they were psychological defenses against temptation itself, a way to literalize the fear that giving in to passion might cost you your soul. The most chilling accounts come from 17th century trial records, where accused witches described being visited by lover spirits who brought them wealth in exchange for feeding them. One woman in Koseg claimed her L'Arc appeared first as a golden rooster, then as a handsome stranger who filled her pantry with grain only for her children to sicken each time she accepted his gifts. Here the legend becomes a warning about exploitation hidden in generosity, the quiet violence of transactional relationships. Even the creature's name whispers of duality. Some scholars link L'Arc to the Slavic leda, meaning to lick, while others argue it derives from lidekniamos, the Hungarian term for sleep paralysis. Both interpretations fit. This was a monster that blurred lines between dream and waking, between lover and predator, now crossed the Carpathians into the Basque country, where another being defied easy categorization. Mary didn't merely walk the line between saint and sorceress, she danced along it, her footprints birthing thunderstorms. Thunder didn't just roll through the Pyrenees, it obeyed. When the shepherds of Basque country saw storm clouds coiling like serpents around Mount Emboto's peak, they knew Mary was awake. This wasn't some distant, ethereal goddess. She walked the mountains in the form of a fiery-eyed woman, her gown woven from lightning, her footsteps leaving behind springs that bubbled hot or cold depending on her mood. Offer her the wrong gift, say, black wool instead of white, and she'd hurl hailstones the size of fists at your barley fields, but leave a slice of fresh bread at a cave's entrance, and she might steer the rains away from your village for a year. Mary didn't just represent nature's power, she was nature in all its terrible beauty. What makes her legend so enduring is its defiance of simple labels. Christian missionaries arriving in the Middle Ages expected pagan deities to fade, yet Mary simply borrowed the Virgin Mary's name, her worship continuing in roadside chapels where candles were lit for the Lady of Emboto. Locals knew better than to confuse the two. While the Virgin Mary forgave, Mary kept ledgers, whistle after dark that was stealing her wind, and she'd send landslides to bury your mill. Harm a fox or owl, they were her spies, and their vengeance would come not from claws, but from freak lightning strikes that left barns smoldering. This wasn't superstition, it was ecology wrapped in myth. By binding human behavior to natural consequences, Mary's taboos preserved fragile mountain ecosystems long before conservation existed. Her underground palaces tell another story. Caves like Santa Mamine weren't just dwellings, they were thresholds. Folk tales describe mortals stumbling into glittering halls where Mary sat on a throne of stalagmites, surrounded by spirits who'd shape-shift between human and animal forms. Some visitors returned with healing herbs, others woke days later on the mountainside, their hair turned white. These accounts mirror shamanic journeys found in cultures worldwide, suggesting Mary's roots stretch back to the Stone Age. Yet she evolved. When the Industrial Revolution brought mines to the Basque Country, new stories emerged of miners hearing a woman's laughter in unexplored tunnels, their lanterns flickering blue just before cave-ins. The goddess of the wild now policed man's encroachment underground. The true genius of Mary's duality lies in her storms. She didn't merely summon bad weather, she weaponized justice. A 15th-century chronicle from Durango tells of a cruel landlord who evicted starving tenants in winter. Days later, a whirlwind tore the roof from his manor, depositing it neatly on the family's drying shed. Such tales weren't just entertainment, they were social leveling. In a region where feudal lords held absolute power, Mary became the great equalizer, her lightning striking the wicked regardless of status. Even the church tacitly acknowledged this. When a drought struck Gippa's Koa in 1623, priests led processions not to Christ, but to Mary's sacred oak, begging her to open the skies. Now turn your gaze east to the Carpathian forests, where another spirit watched one who didn't just punish cruelty, but feasted on greed. The Romanian Zemu might have worn dragon scales, but its true hunger was for human weakness. The trees themselves seemed to lean closer when the Muma Padurii walked, branches bending like curious spectators, roots shifting subtly beneath the moss to make way for her gnarled feet. Travelers who stumbled upon her in the depths of Romanian forests rarely recognized her at first. She looked like any other crone gathering herbs, until they noticed the way birds froze mid-song at her approach, or how wolves would slink from the undergrowth to lick her palms like devoted hounds. This was no mere witch. The forest mother didn't just live among the wild things, she was the wild, her very breath stirring the seasons. Her tests were never straightforward. A lost hunter might find his path blocked by a fallen oak, only for the ancient woman to appear moments later, demanding he share his last crust of bread. Refuse, and the next dawn would find him wandering in circles, his boots filled with burrs and his canteen inexplicably full of spiders. But offer her your cloak unprompted on a rainy night, and suddenly the brambles would part to reveal a hidden trail straight home. The genius of her legend lay in its reciprocity. Nature wasn't just something to fear or conquer, but a conscious force that responded to human decency in kind. Beneath the folklore, historians detect whispers of something far older. The Muma Padurei's affinity for wolves and medicinal plants mirrors attributes of the Dacian earth goddess Bendis, worshipped in these woods long before Rome's legions arrived. Medieval priests demonized her as a hag, yet villagers still left honeyed cakes at forest shrines during droughts, murmuring prayers that blended the Virgin Mary's name with older invocations. This duality reveals a profound truth. The myth wasn't just about morality, but about preserving ecology through story. When a boy was told the Muma turned greedy loggers into mushrooms, he learned sustainable forestry before the word existed. Her most haunting aspect, the way she straddled compassion and cruelty. In one Transylvanian tale, she gifts a starving widow a golden axe, only to transform it into a venomous snake when the woman tries to sell it. The lesson cut deeper than any fable. True generosity shouldn't be transactional. Modern Romanians still recount encounters with a bent-backed figure near protected groves, her pockets spilling with wild strawberries. Whether ghost or archetype, she endures because her core warning remains vital. The forest remembers how you treat it. Now set your compass north, where the mist off the Dutch coast hides a ship with tattered sails and a crew no mortal should ever meet. The Veelegend Hollander doesn't simply haunt the waves, it drags the living into its endless voyage. The sea turned the color of tarnished pewter that evening. the waves slapping against the hull with a rhythm just a little too slow, like a dying heartbeat. That was the first sign something was wrong. Then came the smell, not the usual brine and fish, but something fouler, like wet wood left to rot in a sealed cellar. When the lookout finally shouted, his voice cracked mid-cry. No sailor needed to ask what he'd seen. The ship gliding toward them through the fog needed no lanterns. Its rigging glowed with a sickly blue radiance, sails tattered yet billowing against the windless night. This wasn't just bad luck, this was him. The Dutchman had chosen his audience. Unlike later romantic versions softened by opera and Hollywood, the original legend was soaked in theological terror. 17th-century logs from Antwerp speak of Captain Hendrik van der Decken, who vowed to round the Cape of Good Hope even if God himself stood in his way. When the storm came, he didn't just defy it, he laughed, firing his pistol at the sky. The punishment was poetic, not death but an eternity trapped between worlds, his crew wasting away only to regenerate in an endless cycle of decay. Fishermen who claimed to glimpse the phantom ship told of faces pressed against the portholes, mouths open in silent screams. The lesson couldn't be clearer. Nature's wrath was one thing, but mocking divine authority. That carved your name into history's blackest pages. What makes this legend so fascinating is its evolution. Early Dutch versions framed it as pure morality play, Van der Decken's hubris mirroring the biblical fall of Lucifer. But as the story spread through maritime trade routes, it absorbed local flavors. English sailors added details like the captain's ability to send letters to land, written in brine-soaked ink that faded by dawn. Caribbean versions claim the ship collected souls lost at sea, its hull groaning with the weight of the drowned. Each iteration reflected regional fears, Protestant guilt, the isolation of transatlantic voyages, the terror of uncharted waters where a single storm could erase all evidence of your existence. The most chilling accounts come from naval records. In 1785, the HMS Bristol logged an encounter off the Cape with a vessel showing no colors, its crew moving as if underwater. When challenged, it vanished, but not before sailors swore they heard a voice whisper too late in Dutch. Similar reports peppered the 19th century, often preceding disasters. A whaler out of New Bedford spotted the Dutchman's glow 3 days before a typhoon scattered its fleet. A Portuguese frigate's captain claimed the phantom ship crossed his bow moments before a mutiny erupted. Coincidence, perhaps, but maritime culture thrives on patterns, and the Dutchman became the ultimate bad omen, a reminder that the sea's dangers were as much spiritual as physical. Now shift from the rolling waves to stagnant water, where a different kind of revenant lurked, one that didn't just haunt, but infected. Greece's Virikalakas wasn't content with drinking blood, it spread pestilence with every exhale, its breath so thick with decay it could wilt crops at 20 paces. Imagine a creature that weaponized death itself. The knock came at midnight, 3 slow raps, each one heavier than the last, though no footprints led to the door. Inside, the family huddled in silence, clutching garlic wreaths and prayer books, praying the visitor wouldn't speak their name. This was no ordinary beggar. The Virikalakas never begged. It announced itself with the grim patience of a debt collector, its bloated fingers leaving behind a stench like spoiled meat and wet earth. Greek folklore painted this creature as something far worse than a blood drinker. Unlike the aristocratic vampires of later tales, the Virikalakas was a working-class horror, born from mundane tragedies, a suicide by the olive grove, an unchristened baby buried hastily after plague took its mother. It didn't stalk its victims with seduction or fangs, it infected them through sheer presence, its very breath thick enough to wilt grapevines and sour milk in the jug. What set this legend apart was its terrifying practicality. The Virikalakas didn't just kill, it mimicked real-world contagions with eerie precision. Villagers spoke of outbreaks beginning the morning after its visits, first livestock staggering with foam-flecked jaws, then children spiking fevers that turned their skin ashen. Historians tracing outbreaks in 18th century Crete found chilling correlations. Waves of typhus or malaria often followed reports of walking corpses seen near cemeteries. The creature became nature's perfect scapegoat, embodying the invisible menace of disease long before germ theory existed. Protection methods revealed just how deeply these fears ran. Rather than stakes or holy water, the most effective remedy was exhumation. Families would dig up the suspected Virikalakas, its body oddly preserved despite weeks in the ground, and place a wooden cross or wax cross in its mouth. Some accounts describe stuffing the coffin with poppy seeds, playing on the creature's obsessive need to count them before dawn, a clever stalling tactic to protect the living. These rituals weren't mere superstition, they were early quarantines. By ritualistically killing the source, communities regained a semblance of control over chaos. The true horror lies in the Virikalakas's duality. It wasn't just a monster, it was a warning. Its origins in suicide and improper burial reflected societal taboos, while its disease-spreading nature codified very real public health knowledge. In an era without microscopes, the legend taught vital lessons: isolate the sick, bury the dead properly, and above all, fear the knock that comes too late at night. Modern Greek parents still tease disobedient children with whispers of, "The Virikalakas will come for you," proving some fears never fully fade, they just learn new disguises. Now shift your gaze north to Scandinavia, where mountains themselves could rise and walk. The Jotun didn't just live among the peaks, they carved them into weapons, hurling glaciers like throwing knives and drinking rivers dry in a single gulp. When these giants fought, the very earth reshaped itself. The mountains weren't just alive, they were watching. That's what Norse children learned when winter winds howled through the fjords, shaking longhouses as if something vast had stirred in its sleep. The Jotun weren't mere monsters, they were the glaciers that swallowed farms whole, the geysers that boiled rivers dry, the avalanches that buried entire villages without warning. Medieval Scandinavians didn't just fear these frost giants, they recognized them. When the saga poets described Ymir, the primordial giant whose corpse became the earth itself, they weren't spinning fairy tales. They were explaining why the ground sometimes shook, or why fire burst from cracks in the ice. The Jotun were nature's raw, unfiltered power-given flesh, and they were always hungry. Take Skadi, the huntress who strapped on her snowshoes and marched into Asgard demanding vengeance for her father's death. She could have slaughtered the gods in their sleep. Instead, she bargained, laughter for peace, a husband for her sorrow. Here was a Jotun who defied expectations, her story revealing the Norse reverence for balance. Even their enemies had honor. Then there was Surtur, the flame-wreathed giant destined to engulf the world at Ragnarök. His sword shone brighter than the sun, not because he was evil, but because fire consumes without malice. It simply is. These weren't one-dimensional villains, they were forces of transformation, as necessary to the cycle of life as winter was to spring. The brilliance of these legends lies in their specificity. When villagers spoke of Jotun hurling boulders across valleys, they were describing real geological upheavals. Scandinavia's landscape bears the scars of ancient rock slides and volcanic activity. The tale of Hrungnir, whose heart was made of stone, might explain erratic boulders left by glaciers. Even the giants' weakness, their reliance on human stupidity to cross protective wards, mirrored practical wisdom. Don't invite strangers into your home during blizzards. Don't taunt the storm. Modern climate scientists note something haunting in these stories. As Greenland's ice sheets fracture and Nordic winters grow unpredictable, the Jotun feel less like myth and more like prophecy. Maybe that's why their names still echo in place names like Jotunheimen, home of the giants, where hikers swear the fog sometimes takes shapes too vast to be natural. The Norse didn't fear nature, they respected its agency. In an era of environmental crisis, that lesson lingers like frost on a midnight window. now descend from the frozen north to the sun-baked caves of France, where an older terror waits not with a club, but with a library. The Grangul wasn't just a serpent, she was a librarian of forbidden secrets, her scales inscribed with truths no mortal was meant to read. The palace gardens shimmered under the midday sun, but Count Raymond of Lusignan only had eyes for the woman by the fountain, her laughter like silver bells, her fingers trailing in the water just a moment too long to be human. Melusine seemed to glow from within, her beauty untouched by the years they'd shared, her pregnancies, even the rumors that slithered through court like serpents in the grass. Their love had been a fairy tale until the day Raymond's jealousy got the better of him. He burst into her bathing chamber, spear in hand, and there she was, not a woman, but a creature from the waist down, her serpent's tail sending water cascading over the tiles. In that instant the spell shattered. With a cry that cracked the castle's foundation stones, Melusine plunged through the window, her form twisting into a dragon as she soared toward the horizon. The Count's betrayal didn't just lose him a wife, it cursed his bloodline for generations. What makes Melusine's legend so captivating isn't just the transformation, it's the audacity of her origins. Unlike other medieval monsters lurking in forests or lakes, she walked the halls of power. The Lusignan dynasty proudly traced their lineage to her, turning a supernatural scandal into political mystique. Their castles bore her dragon emblem, their chronicles wove her into their heraldry as if to say, our blood is different, older, touched by magic. This wasn't mere superstition, it was medieval PR. By claiming descent from a being who straddled human and fairy realms, the Lusignans positioned themselves as rulers ordained by forces beyond mere mortal authority. Her influence rippled far beyond French nobility. You can hear echoes of Melusine in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, where love demands unbearable sacrifice. The German tale Undine borrows her tragic core, a water spirit who gains a soul through marriage, only to lose it when betrayed. Even modern fantasy tropes of shape-shifting lovers owe her a debt. But here's the twist, Melusine wasn't just a cautionary tale about forbidden knowledge. She embodied medieval Europe's fascination with liminality, those blurred spaces between human and beast, nobility and the supernatural, loyalty and obsession. When artists depicted her with twin tails like a mermaid split down the middle, they weren't just illustrating a monster, they were visualizing the era's deepest anxieties about duality itself. Now shift your gaze from French castles to the cobbled streets of Prague, where another creation myth took a darker turn. The golem of Jewish folklore wasn't born from a love story, but from necessity, a rabbi's desperate attempt to protect his people. Yet like Melusine, this being of mud and scripture ultimately proved that no creation, however divine its inspiration, remains under its maker's control for long. When Rabbi Judah Low etched the sacred word emet truth into the golem's forehead, he didn't just animate clay, he sparked a rebellion against the very boundaries of life and death. The golem's legend cuts to the heart of humanity's oldest fear, that our creations might outgrow us. Fashioned from riverbank silt and the secret names of God, this hulking figure obeyed without question until the day it didn't. Some say the rabbi forgot to deactivate it for the Sabbath, leaving the creature to roam unrestrained. Others claim it grew too strong, too fast, its fists pounding through ghetto walls in a fury even its creator couldn't calm. The climax always ends the same way, with Rabbi Low scrambling to scrape away the first letter of emet, leaving met death. The golem collapses, lifeless once more, but the message lingers like dust in the air. What sets the golem apart from other medieval horrors is its unsettling relevance. In an age of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, its story feels less like folklore and more like prophecy. The rabbi's dilemma mirrors our own: how to harness power without being destroyed by it, how to play God without becoming the monster. Unlike Melusine's curse, which bound a single family, the golem's warning spans centuries. Every time humanity reaches for the divine spark of creation, we risk awakening something that can't be put back in the box. These final legends, one a noblewoman turned dragon, the other a mud monster turned martyr, bookend the Dark Age's darkest fears. Both ask the same question: what happens when the lines we draw between human and inhuman, between creator and creation, begin to blur? The answer, whispered through centuries of fireside tales, remains as chilling now as it was then. Some truths aren't meant to be seen, some powers aren't meant to be wielded, and some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. The clay clung to Rabbi Judah Lowe's fingers as he shaped the figure's broad shoulders, not the smooth curves of a sculptor's art, but the rough-hewn angles of necessity. Prague's Jewish quarter had endured another pogrom, its cobblestones still slick with blood, its children huddled behind doors bolted too late. This time the rabbi wouldn't just pray. He would act. Under the light of a waning moon in 1580, he traced the Hebrew word emet, truth, into the creature's forehead, chanting secrets older than the Vieltava River. The earth shuddered, the golem opened its eyes. Here was a protector forged from mud and scripture, a being neither fully alive nor merely animated. Unlike the shambling horrors of Christian Europe's witch tales, the golem had no soul to corrupt, only a singular purpose: defend. At first it worked. Villagers spoke of a shadow looming at the edges of mobs, its clay fists crushing weapons before they could be raised. Shopkeepers left bread at the synagogue steps in gratitude, their fingers brushing the golem's dusty footprints as if they were holy relics. But power, even righteous power, has a way of bending its wielder. The rabbi's creation grew stronger with each moon cycle, its movements less deliberate, more hungry. One morning they found a Gentile baker's stall flattened, his loaves trampled into the earth. The golem hadn't been commanded to do that. The legend's brilliance lies in its layers. On the surface, it's a cautionary tale: control what you create, or face the consequences, but dig deeper, and it reveals medieval Judaism's unique tensions. Christian Europe saw demons lurking in every shadow, but Jewish communities faced something more complex: the terror of being both persecuted and powerful. The golem embodied that duality. Its strength came from sacred texts, yet its violence mirrored the very forces it was made to resist. When Rabbi Lowe finally erased the aleph from emet, reducing it to met, death, he wasn't just deactivating a tool. He was acknowledging a terrible truth: salvation and destruction often share the same breath. Fast forward to modern robotics labs, where engineers cite the golem as an early lesson in AI ethics. The parallels are uncanny. Both creations start as solutions, guardians against human vulnerability. Both evolve beyond their programming, and both force us to ask, when does a tool become a threat? The golem's clay fists might seem quaint compared to neural networks, but the fear is identical. We still whisper the same question into the dark: how do we unmake what we've made? Yet there's a twist rarely discussed. The golem wasn't just a Jewish story, it was a secret shared with Prague's Christian neighbors. In a rare moment of cultural exchange, Gentile craftsmen helped repair the synagogue after a storm, their hands working alongside Jewish ones. For a brief time, the monster that divided them became a bridge. Maybe that's the real lesson lurking in the legend: creation isn't the danger, it's the refusal to see what we've built with clear eyes. Whether clay or code, every act of making carries the same warning: tread carefully, for the line between guardian and destroyer is written in dust, waiting for the next breath to sweep it away. Now turn your gaze from Prague's ghetto to the misty ports of Cornwall, where another kind of maker worked his magic not with holy words, but with the promise of gold and the weight of a signed contract. The devil might have been Europe's ultimate deal-maker, but in these coastal villages, fishermen knew a lesser-known truth: some bargains aren't struck in hell. They're whispered at low tide by something far older, its teeth gleaming like wet pearls in the dark. These 22 myths aren't just relics of a superstitious past, they're masterclasses in human ingenuity. When the world lacked microscopes to explain plagues or meteorology to predict storms, our ancestors wove stories so vivid they could outlast empires. Think about it, the Black Shuck legend didn't just frighten children away from misty moors, it encoded real dangers like rabies outbreaks or lone wolves into a narrative anyone could understand. The Wild Hunt's thunderous riders gave voice to the terror of Viking raids, transforming faceless violence into something with rules, something you could ward off with iron or prayers. Even the seemingly whimsical Trascu, with his endless pranks, taught practical lessons about responsibility and the consequences of carelessness in an era where a single spilled candle could doom a thatched roof. But here's what's truly remarkable: these legends didn't just explain the world, they shaped it. Medieval villages organized their lives around these tales. Farmers avoided cutting certain trees to appease the Tylwyth-Teg, preserving old-growth forests that stabilized the soil. Coastal communities developed taboos against fishing during spawning seasons, cloaked as warnings of the Nixie's wrath. The myths became unwritten laws, enforcing ecological balance and social order long before modern science or governance could. That's why the church often struggled to stamp them out. You can't erase a story that holds generations of survival knowledge, no matter how many saints you preach about. And then there's comfort. For all their teeth and claws, these creatures often served as morbid companions in a brutal world. The Dullahan's inevitability mirrored the acceptance of mortality in societies where life expectancy barely reached 40. The Muma Pajari's selective kindness taught that nature wasn't just an enemy, it could be negotiated with, even trusted if approached correctly. Even the golem, for all its destructive potential, represented hope that the oppressed could forge their own protectors when no one else would. These weren't just tales to scare, they were coping mechanisms, ways to stare into the abyss and whisper, "I see you." Fast forward to today, and their DNA is everywhere. The Sluagh's shrieking horde lives on in zombie apocalypse films, reflecting modern fears of pandemics and mob mentality. The Jotun's climate warping fury feels unnervingly relevant in an age of melting glaciers. Even corporate dystopias borrow from the golem's warning how many tech billionaires have accidentally created monsters in pursuit of progress. The mediums changed, but the messages didn't. Our smartphones might replace campfires, yet we still crave stories that help us decipher life's chaos. So the next time you dismiss these legends as primitive fables, ask yourself, what myths are we crafting right now? In 200 years, what will our descendants unravel about our fears when they study the creatures haunting our streaming services and novels? The answer might just reveal more about today's world than any history book could. After all, the darkest shadows are always the ones we cast ourselves. Now it's your turn. Which of these 22 legends slithered under your skin? Drop a comment below, and if you've enjoyed this dive into the dark corners of history, hit subscribe. The past has plenty more whispers to share, and we're just